I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
So, as many of you know, I am about to publish a new book called The Gap in God's Country, a longer view on our culture wars. And so what I wanted to do this summer while I'm cooking up ideas for like future classes for the Maurin Academy is to discuss certain elements in this book that interested me, elements that I think I'd like you guys to know more about. I got a little creative in writing this book. I mean, it features things as disparate as a discussion of the Leave It to Beaver show, and this book by V.S. Naipaul. It's called In a Free State. Naipaul was a Trinidadian author. He spent most of his adult life in England. A very accomplished author. And I knew nothing about Naipaul until a friend of mine who has had some influence on my research and whose book I hope to help publish someday, mentioned Naipaul and his story in this book, In a Free State. It's called One Out of Many. The reason why I bring this story up in the book is because it's an excellent depiction of what we call dislocation or disembedding. Some of you probably know I did a fairly lengthy series a while back about the book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age. And one of the things that Taylor goes into great lengths about is that the modern world is characterized by what he called disembedding. Dislocation, disembedding, root shock is another term I use in the book. And it used to be an experience that people had if they, for instance, had to move from one country to another because they were a refugee or just for any reason, or if you move from one city to another city, or a town, your place of origin to someplace else, a different way of life. This would result in a certain type of basically psychological trauma. And it can cause depression, anxiety, can cause political extremism too, which is why I'm interested in it as a political theorist. This story isn't about that. It's not about the development of political extremism, but it is a story about how a person feels when they're disembedded. Now, I guess I want to make the argument, and I try to in the book, that this feeling of dislocation or disembeddedness is now something that most people living in our times have to deal with in some respects, even if they don't move. Although one of the things that characterizes our time is definitely our mobility, right? We're no longer attached to place. I think that's become a commonplace observation for the Maurin Academy, right? We are no longer attached to place. Front Porch Republic folks are all about that as well. And I think a lot of people of various types are becoming aware of the transience is a problem for our psychology. And that's even if even if, we move to a better situation financially, right? Which is what happens in this story. Now, this story is about a man it's post-colonial. This was written in the 70s. So this probably happened in the 60s or 70s. I mean, based on some of the details in the story, I think it was meant to be around the time it was written. And it's about a man who comes from India, where he lived in Bombay which is now Mumbai, but Bombay is how it's spelled here. He lived there with his employer, who was a diplomat. And at a certain point, his employer is called to Washington, D.C. And at first, he doesn't want to go, right? And the employer doesn't want to take him. So the first part of the story describes the type of life he led there in as a more or less a servant to his employer. The employer is never named, and I think that's because that's not important. He is his, sort of social superior, and yet they have this relationship of understanding where each person has their role and there's a certain mutual regard. So it's kind of feudalistic in a way, the relationship. And this man, who's the main character in the story, his name is Santos. And he has a little closet, more or less, in his employer's home where he could sleep at night, but he describes that he preferred to sleep on the street, and many people did. And the people who worked in the home were there. They'd bring out their bedding. They would talk. They would, play cards together. They'd smoke and so on and so forth. And it was perfectly normal practice to just sleep out under the stars, although he had a place to go if he couldn't do that. So he depicts his situation as very stable. He's basically living a life that he enjoys. He has a little bit of prestige because he's attached to this important man. He doesn't he's depicted as not feeling a lot of class resentment, not any actually, and that's what makes me sort of characterize it as feudal in a sense, the hierarchy was natural. So he's enjoying his life, but then his employer gets the call. And like I said, at first he doesn't want to take him because it would be expensive. Washington, D.C. is expensive. The exchange rate is very bad for the rupee. But then eventually he does decide to take Santos. And Santos is ready to go because the alternative is to be unemployed because his employer is not going to keep the household open, it sounds like. And so even though Santos has a wife and children, and it never says how many children he has or anything about his wife, doesn't name her, even though he has a wife and children in the hills outside of Bombay, I guess, whom he must not see very often to begin with, he just goes with him. And actually for the rest of the story, except for I think one time, maybe two times, the wife and children aren't even mentioned. They're just sort of, I guess maybe this character would have thought of them as a financial obligation of some kind. But it doesn't even say that he sent back money. So that's interesting. But I think the presumption is that he would still be connected with India and that perhaps he could go back at some point. That this was not necessarily a permanent move, but it becomes a permanent move. So the first description of dislocation appears very soon after he gets into the airplane. At first, the airplane, and I think this is the first flight this man would have ever taken, the airplane seems really great. Now, the stewardess kind of looks askance at him because he's in peasant clothes and sort of sends him to the back. He's got all of his packs with him. This was long before they limited your luggage, apparently. And he's got, rude country ways, so to speak. He's chewing something tobacco-like. He doesn't understand that the drinks cost money, so he's chewing tobacco, but he realizes then he doesn't have anywhere to spit it. So it's like then he swallows this, and then because he doesn't know like about the drinks, that he gets a drink which he can't pay for, that's champagne. So he drinks alcohol after. Anyway, you can imagine, right? So then after that, he's feeling mighty gross. Let's just say, I'll put it delicately, and that and sort of like people's response to him on the plane is a very jarring experience. And so even before he hits the ground in the United States, even with the Indian stewardess, he's feeling himself out of place because in this plane, class matters in a way that it didn't, the same connotations did not apply when he was on Indian soil. So that kind of says right away, this culture that this man was embedded in was profoundly affected his expectations of the world, his sense of self, and it was pretty much taken for granted. It was entirely taken for granted, and so even being on this plane and having this experience is this jarring, nauseating, dizzying, dreadful experience. And what you find in this story is that he swings wildly back and forth, Santos does, between this horrible feeling of complete groundlessness and a momentary happiness where some victory is had, you know. So, you know, when he gets to Washington, D.C., he's got some quarters, nothing big, but he's got a place to sleep. He's going to be the cook to his employer. And he's given a little bit of money, which he is first like, wow, I've got some money. And the employer warns him that it's not going to translate into very much. But he doesn't really listen. He's just dizzied by the whole situation. The employer says, go out and have a good time. He goes out, he buys a cup of coffee. I think he tries to go to a movie. Anyway, pretty soon the money's pretty much gone, and he realizes this. So again, he goes from extreme kind of excitement and happiness to existential dread. You know, what have I done? I'm such a dope. I'm embarrassed. So there's this, you sense this growing self-awareness that comes from being in a different culture and having these kinds of experiences. In a culture in which you're embedded, which many of us have never truly experienced, you apparently just don't. There's not that call for self-consciousness. But when you're in another situation and you're disembedded, you automatically, of course, become aware of how you must appear to others, and others become more important in that light. Okay. And so he's having that experience, and he realizes that he's sort of trapped here because he's never going to have enough money to pay for all the things that he needs, many of which he did not have to pay for. Now he does in India, he does have the roof over his head and he has the food, but even like clothes or anything else he wants, he would have to pay for. And now he's beginning to realize in Washington, that's not easy and it's not going to be possible. So he's sort of stuck. Okay. He's stuck. He feels like he's a prisoner now, rather than the way he felt so free in India. And then one of the more interesting episodes early on is where, for the first time, I'm pretty sure it was the first time, or at least the first time that a mirror was readily available, he really looked at himself in a mirror. And he says he studied his face. He says in Bombay, a week or a month could pass without looking in the mirror. And then it wasn't to consider my looks, but to check out whether the barber had cut off too much hair or whether a pimple was about to burst. Okay. But then in this new context, he looks at himself in the mirror, and he looks at himself multiple times a day, of course, and he discovers that he has good looks, like in his mind, which I bet wasn't what you expected to happen. He looks at himself and he's like, wow, you're a handsome dude. So now he sort of develops this vanity about himself and his looks, but his looks compared to the clothes that he can afford is unacceptable. Okay, so he starts to become more aware of his rough feet and his clothes and all of these external accoutrements. Okay, um, so he says, I became more careful of my appearance. There wasn't much I could do. I bought laces for my old black shoes, socks, and a belt. Then some money came my way. And that was because I guess the weed, he calls it the weed. He says the weed I smoked, which wouldn't be the same thing as the weed he was chewing, which I think was still tobacco. But I do believe the weed that he smoked was weed. And therefore, he says, I discovered that it was of high value to the hubshi. Hubshi is the word that he uses, I guess, Hindi word for Black people. And one of the undercurrents of this story is that this man, Santos, because of the culture that he comes from, has a real strong prejudice against Black people. Um, as in, like, there's this like automatic response and this notion that people like himself shouldn't be around them. So but nevertheless, he's met a Black woman. He does befriend and then have a relationship with a Black woman, and he discovers along the way that this weed has value, and so he sells it and he gets a couple $100 for it, and then that gives him the money to buy this green suit, which sounds like a ridiculous purchase. Okay. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's never had a suit before. He goes into a store and says, sell me a suit. The guy, or he grabs the first suit he sees, tries it on. It doesn't fit, but he doesn't care. And he doesn't care about the fact that it's probably a pretty ugly suit. He won't take the advice of the salesperson, and he buys the suit, and then he never wears it. He says he wears the pants eventually, but he basically never wears it because it looks so bizarre compared to what he's used to, and he feels like he would stand out so much. So you start to feel the self-consciousness of this person that has developed, the anxiety. Okay. First, when he was embedded, he didn't have any of that. Everything was kind of given. He was relatively unself-conscious. He kind of knew what was coming, right? And now in this other country, in this very different circumstance, he becomes class conscious in a way he wasn't before. He becomes more vain. He's looking at his appearance. He's looking at the superficial, what kind of clothes he wears. He's feeling anxiety because he feels like he can never measure up with these new uncomfortable alien standards. He's not even sure he likes those standards, but at the same time, he definitely wants to have the esteem of others, which he previously just had by being in the employ of his rather distinguished employer. Okay. And that starts to translate into the way he sees his employer. So now he sees him in a more self-conscious way too. He says, now I found that without wishing it, I was ceasing to see myself as part of my employer's presence, and beginning at the same time to see him as an outsider might see him, as perhaps the people who came to dinner in the apartment saw him. I saw that he was a man of my own age, around 35. It was astonishing to me that I hadn't noticed this before. I saw that he was plump, in need of exercise, and that he moved with short, fussy steps, a man with glasses, thinning hair, and that habit during conversation of scraping his mustache against his teeth with his teeth and nibbling at the inside of his top lip. A man who was frequently anxious, took pains over his work, was subjected at his own table to unkind remarks by his office colleagues, a man who looked as uneasy in Washington as I felt, who acted as cautiously as I had learned to act. So now not only is he self-conscious about himself, but he also is no longer able to feel himself just a part of his employer in a given relationship, but he looks at his employer from a bird's eye view, from this other perspective, right? And he starts to see all of his flaws. And suddenly, guess what happens? There is a very jarring, disconcerting sense of basically equality and mediocrity, which is a democratic feeling, right? Equality and mediocrity. It's humbling and at the same time exalting in a weird sort of way. And it erases previously organic relationships in a society such as this man Santos came from. And so this is not, I mean, in a way, he might have felt somewhat amused for a split second, but for the most part, discovering that he'd never really looked at his employer this way before and then looking at him this way is a very disturbing experience. So I'm going to talk more about this story. This story is going to occupy probably another couple of weeks. But what I want to get across just now is notice how this transformation that's taken place already in this man into a personality that's closer to the way we are now in the United States in particular, and anywhere in the westernized world, which is a transient world. It's a world in which it's harder and harder to connect to a culture in a really substantial way. The culture that we talk about, oftentimes that we try to even embrace, is more superficial than we can even imagine. And so to me, what makes this story profound is not just that I can understand now the immigrant's experience, but that the inner world of this man is so similar to the way we are now in the 21st century in the United States, and I would bet in many other places in the world, where these feelings are just par for the course and they are a part of every day, and they continue to create this disorienting. He uses the term empty at a couple of points. Disorienting experience of dislocation that we've become so inured to in a way that we don't realize exactly why we feel as anxious as we do. Okay, so anyway, I will continue with this next week. Again, this is because my book, The Gap in God's Country, has quite a bit of material in it about dislocation. And all of all the causes of it, some of which have nothing to do with physical location, and all of the ramifications of it. It's not just about that, but that forms part of my argument. And this book, this story that comes from the book In a Free State by V.S. Naipaul, really helped me to get back into the frame of mind of somebody initially experiencing dislocation. I will put the information about the book, which you can still get, along with a lot of other of Naipaul's books, in the show notes in case you're curious and you want to pick up this book. I actually got mine at a library. Libraries still have these things. Isn't that great? So you probably could do that too. Interlibrary loan is a great thing. All right. See you next week.